I could still hear the sound of the glass shattering. It wasn't the first thing to break that day. The vase hit the floor, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces, but my heart had already shattered long before. The room was silent, except for my ragged breathing and the echo of his words still slicing through me like a blade. "I can't marry you anymore." I stared at him, waiting for something, anything that would make it all make sense. But his eyes, once so full of promises and plans, were empty now. Cold. A stranger stood in front of me, wearing the face of the man I loved. "What did you say?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "You heard me," he said, taking a step back as if I was the fragile one. "I can't do this. Not with everything that's happening to you. You need someone stronger." Stronger? I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. The room swayed, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if it was shock or the illness pulling me under. My legs buckled, but I forced myself to stay standing. I wouldn't collapse, not in front of him. "You were supposed to be stronger," I spat, the words bitter on my tongue. "We were supposed to be stronger." He shook his head, almost pityingly, and that was the worst part, like he was convinced this was some kind of mercy. My whole world was unraveling at the seams, and he stood there, perfectly composed, as if my pain was something he could walk away from without a scratch. I could feel the heat of the tears building behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You asked me to marry you," I said, the memory of his proposal now a cruel joke. "You promised me forever." His silence answered everything. In that moment, something inside me snapped. Love had brought me to this place, but love had also burned me alive. I reached for the nearest thing, an old vase we bought together on some lazy Sunday afternoon, and threw it with everything I had. The crash reverberated through the room, the shards scattering across the floor like the remnants of my faith in him. He flinched, but didn't say a word. A sick sort of calm settled over me as I looked at him one last time. I thought of all the times he had told me he would stand by me, through storms and struggles, in sickness and in health. But when the storm came, he ran. I exhaled slowly, letting the silence fill the space between us. He didn't deserve my anger. He didn't deserve me. "Get out," I said quietly, but my voice cut like steel. "I don't need you." For the first time, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe. But it was too late. I turned away as his footsteps faded behind me, and the door closed with a soft, final click. The emptiness was deafening. I looked at the broken glass on the floor, the symbol of everything that had fallen apart in a matter of minutes. My body felt weak, trembling from the aftershock. But there was something else now, a slow burning fire beneath the ruin. The pain twisted inside me, but in its place, something new took root, defiance. If he couldn't stand by me, I would stand by myself. If the world expected me to crumble, I would rise higher than I ever had. The disease wasn't going to break me, and neither was he. I took one last deep breath and whispered into the silence, a promise forged in the embers of my heart. "You'll regret leaving me." It's strange how love begins, not with a grand revelation, but with something small. A glance. A laugh. A moment when the rest of the world fades, and suddenly, someone becomes everything. For me, it started with his smile. It was the kind of smile that made you believe in second chances and quiet mornings. I remember the exact day we met, as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. The cafe on the corner of Fifth Avenue, the one with the chipped brick and the terrible coffee, but the best window seat. I was running late, papers spilling out of my bag, my life a mess as usual. I crashed into him at the door, practically burying him under my disaster of a morning. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, trying to scoop up the papers. "I wasn't looking..." And then I looked up. There he was, hair tousled like he'd just come in from the wind, eyes that crinkled at the edges when he smiled. His laughter was warm, like sunlight on a cold day. "No harm done," he said, kneeling to help me. "Unless those papers are worth millions?" I laughed despite myself. "Only if you're into mediocre grant proposals." "Ah, then we're safe." He handed me the last of the scattered mess. "Do you make it a habit of taking out innocent bystanders? Or am I just special?" I should have been annoyed, late for a meeting and covered in humiliation, but instead, I was enchanted. Something about him made the chaos feel less crushing. We ended up sharing that window seat after all. And from that moment, everything shifted. His name was Liam. He was an architect with big dreams and bigger plans. He was magnetic, the kind of person you couldn't help but be drawn to. And somehow, he was drawn to me too. Our story unfolded in stolen hours and city lights. I had never known a love like that, a love that felt like home and fire all at once. Every date, every conversation felt like we were building something unshakable. We stayed up late talking about dreams and fears, tracing the invisible threads of each other's souls like cartographers mapping uncharted territory. I told him things I had never told anyone. The dreams I kept locked away because they felt too fragile. The fear of being ordinary. The ache for something more. And he listened, not just to my words, but to everything I wasn't saying. And he? He had an artist's mind hidden beneath his polished exterior. He sketched the world the way he saw it, full of possibility and wonder. "One day," he whispered to me under the glow of the city skyline, "I'm going to build something that will outlast us both." I believed him. I believed in us. We weren't perfect, nobody is, but we fit together like mismatched puzzle pieces that somehow made a beautiful picture. I thought we could weather anything. The day he proposed was magic. We'd taken a weekend trip to the countryside, a break from the rush of deadlines and the noise of life. I remember the golden haze of the afternoon, the way the sun dipped behind the hills like it was trying to hide just to watch what came next. We sat beneath an ancient oak tree, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and suddenly the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "I know this isn't some grand, choreographed moment," he said, voice steady but eyes nervous. "But life isn't perfect. Neither are we. But I want every imperfect moment with you. Will you marry me?" The answer was already in my heartbeat, in the way my soul leapt before my mind caught up. "Yes," I whispered, laughing through the tears that spilled over my cheeks. 1,000 times, yes. We kissed under that old oak tree, as if sealing a vow that the universe itself would bear witness to. I thought that was our forever, a beginning carved out of love and hope. But love isn't always enough. I didn't know that back then. I thought that when you chose someone, it meant you stayed, through the highs and the lows, through celebrations and battles, through triumphs and diagnoses. When the doctor called me into his office 6 months before our wedding, I was too distracted by seating charts and flower arrangements to consider that my life was about to derail. The word illness felt foreign in my mouth. I had gone in expecting to be told I needed rest or vitamins. Not this. Not something that could change the trajectory of everything. But I told myself it was just another storm to weather, a challenge to overcome with grit and love. I called Liam as soon as I left the clinic. My hands were shaking, but my heart wasn't. I was sure of him. He had always been my steady lighthouse when the waters were rough. When he picked up the phone, his voice was calm and reassuring, until he heard the crack in mine. "Talk to me," he said. "What's going on?" I could barely get the words out. "The tests, something's wrong. They found something." There was a pause, one that felt like a lifetime. Then, "I'm on my way." He met me at home within the hour, and when I opened the door, he pulled me into the tightest embrace. His hand stroked my hair as I cried into his chest, every sob peeling away the layers of fear I hadn't realized I'd been holding in. "It's going to be okay," he whispered against my temple. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it together." For a moment, I believed him. But that moment didn't last. When the first round of treatments left me weaker, he started to pull away. I saw it in the way his hand lingered less in mine, in the way he stared past me like he was somewhere else entirely. The Liam who had knelt under the oak tree and promised me forever was slipping away, slowly at first, then all at once. The past that had once felt like a fairy tale was becoming a slow-motion tragedy. I told myself it was temporary, that love was enough to hold us together. But love that isn't tested is just a dream. The worst part about losing someone isn't when they leave. It's the slow unraveling, the painful awareness that they're already gone long before they walk away. If I had known then what I know now, maybe I would have been the one to walk away first. I don't remember the exact moment things started to change, but I remember the feeling, like a slow, creeping chill seeping into the cracks of something once warm and whole. At first, I told myself it was in my head. I clung to the belief that love like ours didn't just fade, but no matter how tightly I held on, I could feel it slipping through my fingers. The first time I noticed it was during the second hospital visit. The doctor was explaining my treatment plan, his voice calm but clinical, mapping out weeks of medications and side effects like it was just another routine. I sat there absorbing every word, doing my best not to show how terrified I was. I felt Liam's hand on mine, warm but unmoving, like he was trying to ground me. But when I glanced at him, his gaze was distant, his jaw tight. He wasn't with me. Not really. His mind was somewhere else entirely. "Liam?" I whispered, hoping to pull him back. He blinked, startled, like I'd caught him in a lie. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm listening." But he wasn't, and that was the first crack. Later that evening, I convinced myself I was overreacting. He was scared, just like I was. Maybe he didn't know how to process it yet. But deep down, something in me stirred, a quiet warning that I tried to silence. The cracks grew wider after that. He started working late. More meetings, more projects, more reasons not to be home. I told myself it was just how he coped. He'd always buried himself in his work when life got overwhelming. I was fine, I told myself. I didn't need him to sit by my side every second of the day. I could handle it. But some nights, after the exhaustion of the treatment sank in, the house felt too quiet. I would curl up on the couch, a blanket draped over my trembling legs, and wait for the sound of his keys in the lock. I'd imagine the warmth of his arms around me, whispering reassurances that everything was going to be okay. But the door never opened at the times I needed it most. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of appointments, I cooked dinner. It wasn't much, just pasta and some salad, but I wanted to feel normal for a little while. I set the table, lit a candle, and waited. He texted me at the last minute. "Work emergency. I'll be late." I stared at the message, my appetite dissolving. The food sat untouched, the candle flickering against the empty chair across from me. I didn't cry. I was too tired for that. Instead, I sat there in the dim light, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. By the time he came home, it was past midnight. His tie was loosened, his hair messy. I watched him drop his keys on the counter and grab a bottle of water like nothing was wrong. "Hey," he said, glancing at me. "You're still up?" I forced a smile. "I made dinner." He froze, guilt flashing across his face for a second too long. "I'm sorry," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Today was crazy." I stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. "It's always crazy," I said, my voice softer than I wanted it to be. "Is this how it's going to be from now on?" He looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw the man I fell in love with, the man who once said he couldn't wait to spend every moment of forever with me. But then his face hardened, the mask slipping back into place. "You're making this sound like I'm abandoning you," he said defensively. "I'm trying to hold everything together." "And what about me?" My voice cracked. I didn't mean for it to sound so broken, but the words fell out before I could stop them. "Who's holding me together?" The room was suffocatingly still. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, and then he sighed. "I can't be everything, okay? I'm trying." The word trying felt like a dagger. I wasn't asking him to be everything. I was asking him to be here. To look at me like I was still the woman he loved, not some fragile thing breaking apart before his eyes. He kissed my forehead, a hollow, mechanical gesture, and muttered, "Get some rest." Then he walked away, leaving me alone in the dim kitchen, the candle burning down to nothing. I should have screamed after him, demanded answers. but I was tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. I sat back down and watched the wax drip down the sides of the candle until the flames sputtered out completely. The days blurred together after that. I spent more time at the hospital and less time in our home because it wasn't ours anymore. It felt like a stranger's house, sterile and cold. The warmth had been drained out of it. We stopped talking about the future. Wedding plans became afterthoughts, tucked away in drawers we never opened. The invitation sat unaddressed on the desk in the office. My dress, once a symbol of hope, hung like a ghost in the closet, wrapped in plastic as if preserving some dead thing. I could feel it coming, the storm that would tear us apart. Every look, every unspoken word, every late-night excuse was another crack forming in the walls of the life we'd built. But no matter how much I braced myself, I wasn't ready for the moment it all came crashing down. The worst part of a breaking heart isn't the explosion. It's the slow, steady pressure that comes before, the creeping realization that something precious is slipping away and you're powerless to stop it. I wanted to believe he'd find his way back to me. I wanted to believe that love could endure anything. But every night I spent alone, staring at the empty space where he should have been, that belief grew weaker. And somewhere, in the quiet recesses of my mind, a voice whispered a truth I didn't want to hear. Sometimes, love isn't enough. I knew something was wrong before he even said a word. It was in the way he walked through the door that evening, slow, hesitant, like he was bracing himself for a blow. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes flickered toward me, then away, as though even looking at me was too much. I'd seen that expression before, on strangers in hospital waiting rooms who'd just received the kind of news that changed everything. But this wasn't supposed to be our story. Not like this. He stood in the doorway, his fingers tightening around the strap of his bag. The silence between us stretched out, suffocating. The air was thick with something unsaid, and I could feel it pressing down on my chest. "Liam," I said, my voice surprisingly calm despite the storm building inside me. "What's going on?" He swallowed hard. For a moment, I thought I saw his resolve falter. Maybe, somewhere deep down, he wanted to take it all back before he even said it. But then he took a step forward, and I knew. Everything was about to break. "I can't do this anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I blinked, certain I had misheard him. "What?" The word came out small and fragile, like a plea. He set his bag down and ran a hand through his hair, pacing like a caged animal. "This, us, the wedding, everything." His voice cracked, but there was no softness in his tone, no kindness to soften the edges of his betrayal. "I can't marry you." Time seemed to stop. The walls, the floor, the very air around me, all of it blurred, like the world was folding in on itself. I stared at him, unable to comprehend the weight of what he was saying. You don't mean that." My voice was trembling now, disbelief giving way to panic. "You're just overwhelmed. We both are. But we can fix this. We've been through too much." "No." His voice was firm this time, cutting through my desperation like a blade. "This isn't something we can fix." I felt my stomach twist, a sickening knot of fear and anger and devastation. "Is this about my illness?" The words burned on their way out. "Is that what this is really about?" He didn't answer right away, but the look in his eyes was answer enough. I felt my heart splinter, the cracks spreading like wildfire. "Liam." I stepped closer, my voice breaking. "You promised. You told me we'd face this together. You told me—" "I know what I told you," he snapped, his voice louder than I'd ever heard it. The anger wasn't directed at me. It was at himself. But it didn't matter. It still cut me to pieces. He raked a hand through his hair again and let out a long, shaky breath. I thought I could handle it. I wanted to handle it. But every day, it's like I'm watching you slip away. And I can't. His voice cracked again, and this time, the vulnerability in it was unmistakable. "I can't watch you suffer." The irony was cruel enough to make me laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed in the quiet room. "You can't watch me suffer?" I repeated, the words dripping with disbelief. "Liam, I'm the one living this. I'm the one fighting every damn day to stay on my feet. You're not the one who's sick." He closed his eyes like he couldn't bear to hear the truth. "I'm not strong enough," he whispered. "You deserve someone who is." I stared at him, the man I had once trusted with every piece of my heart, the man who had promised me forever. And in that moment, I realized something that nearly broke me in two. He wasn't leaving because he didn't love me. He was leaving because he did, and because he was a coward. "You don't get to decide that for me," I said, my voice steadier now, sharp with fury. "You don't get to walk away and act like it's some noble sacrifice. You're not protecting me. You're protecting yourself." His face crumpled, guilt twisting his features. "I'm sorry." "Don't." I held up a hand, cutting him off. I wouldn't let him hide behind apologies. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't undo the promises you broke." Tears burned at the edges of my vision, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. He didn't deserve to see me cry. Not after this. He took a step toward me, and for a fleeting second, I thought he was going to change his mind. That he would pull me into his arms and tell me he was sorry. That he was scared, but he loved me too much to leave. But instead, he whispered, "Goodbye." And just like that, he was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, frozen, staring at the place where he'd stood only moments ago. My mind couldn't catch up. It was as though my body hadn't yet accepted the truth that my heart already knew. I was alone. The weight of it crashed down on me all at once, and I sank to my knees, the sobs tearing out of me like a storm. I clutched my chest, as if I could physically hold my heart together before it shattered completely. But it was too late. The pieces were already broken beyond repair. I screamed into the emptiness, a raw, guttural sound that felt like it was being ripped from the deepest part of my soul. The man I had built my life around had walked away, and all I had left were the ruins. The wedding plans, the future we dreamed of, the life we were supposed to have. It was all gone. After what felt like hours, I finally pulled myself off the floor. My hands were shaking, my face was streaked with tears, but somewhere beneath the devastation, a new emotion stirred. Rage. He had left me at my lowest, but I wasn't going to stay there. He had chosen fear over love, but I wouldn't let his weakness define my story. I wasn't just going to survive this, I was going to rise from it, stronger, unbreakable. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and whispered into the emptiness, my voice steady despite everything. "You'll regret this, Liam. I swear you will." And in that moment, I wasn't the broken girl he'd left behind. I was something new, something stronger. The flames of my heartbreak had forged me into steel. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The days after Liam left were a blur of pain and silence. I woke up every morning to an empty bed, the cold sheets next to me a cruel reminder of his absence. The echoes of his goodbye haunted me, replaying in my mind like a broken record I couldn't turn off. But no matter how deep the wound, I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. I told myself it couldn't end this way. People don't just abandon the love of their life without looking back. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he needed time. I clung to the maybes like a drowning person clings to driftwood, convinced that if I could just reach him, I could pull him back. The first time I called him, he didn't answer. The second time, it rang until voicemail picked up. By the third call, my voice cracked as I left the message. "Liam, please. I don't understand how you can walk away from everything we've built. I need you to talk to me. Please, don't do this." I ended the call and stared at the phone, willing it to ring. It never did. But I wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The next day, I showed up at his office. The receptionist gave me a wary look as I walked in, disheveled and determined. She hesitated when I asked if he was available. I must have looked desperate because she nodded reluctantly and gestured toward his office. He was at his desk when I walked in, papers scattered around him. He looked up, startled, and for a split second, I saw something flash across his face. Guilt, maybe even regret. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by that familiar, guarded expression. "Alex?" he said, standing up slowly. What are you doing here? I closed the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if I was angry, scared, or just broken. Probably all three. You won't return my calls, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. So I didn't have a choice. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. We've already said everything there is to say. No, I shot back, stepping closer. You made a decision and walked away. I didn't get a say in any of it. He looked down at his desk, as if the papers there held answers to questions he couldn't face. What do you want from me, Alex? I felt my throat tighten, but I forced the words out. I want you to come home. The room went silent. He didn't speak, didn't move, and the longer the silence stretched, the colder it felt. I know you're scared, I continued, my voice softer now. I am too, but we can still have the life we dreamed of. The wedding, the future, all of it. We can get through this. Together. His jaw clenched, and I could see the war raging behind his eyes. For a moment, hope flickered in my chest. But then he looked at me, and the truth in his gaze hit me like a punch to the gut. I can't, he whispered. I'm not who you need me to be anymore. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to stand tall. You don't get to decide that for me, I said, anger breaking through the cracks in my voice. You don't get to give up on us without trying. I've already tried. His voice rose, the frustration boiling over. Don't you get it? I've been trying for months, pretending I could handle this, pretending I was strong enough. But I'm not. I'm not. The rawness of his confession stunned me into silence. I'd spent so long thinking he'd left because he didn't love me, but the truth was almost worse. He left because he wasn't brave enough to love me through the pain. So that's it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You're giving up because you're afraid? He turned away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own guilt. It's not just fear, he muttered. It's everything. I can't be the person you need. I don't know how to watch you go through this without falling apart. You're not supposed to have all the answers. I stepped forward, grabbing his arm and forcing him to face me. You think I'm not terrified? You think I don't feel like I'm falling apart every second of every day? But I chose you, Liam. I chose you because I believed you'd stay even when it got hard. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he shook his head. You deserve more than someone who's already broken. And I deserve more than someone who walks away, I shot back, my voice rising. But here we are. He closed his eyes, as if trying to shut out the truth of my words. I'm sorry, he said again, and this time, the finality in his voice made something inside me break all over again. I let go of his arm, the weight of it all pressing down on me like a crushing tide. You're a coward, I whispered. You promised me forever, and you ran the second it got real. Tears slid down my cheeks, but I didn't care. The anger that had fueled me drained away, leaving only heartbreak in its wake. I stared at the man I had once trusted with my whole soul, realizing that the person standing in front of me was no longer the man I loved. He was a stranger wearing his face. I hope one day you understand what you've done, I said quietly. I hope it haunts you. His breath hitched, and for a brief second, I saw his mask crack, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing he could say would change what he'd done. I turned and walked out of the office, each step heavier than the last. I felt like a part of me was being left behind in that room, but I knew I couldn't stay. Not after everything. When I reached the street, the cold air hit me like a slap. I gasped, the weight of reality sinking in fully for the first time. He wasn't coming back. No matter how hard I had fought, no matter how many pieces of my heart I laid bare in front of him, he had made his choice. I stood there, trembling in the middle of the busy city street as strangers rushed past me, oblivious to the devastation unraveling inside me. And that's when it hit me. Something terrifying, something freeing. I was done trying. For the first time since it all began, I stopped begging for someone to stay. I stopped chasing what was already lost. Liam had walked away from me, but I wasn't going to walk away from myself. As the sun set behind the skyline, I wiped my tears, took a deep breath, and whispered to myself, It's time to stop fighting for someone who stopped fighting for me. The battle I had been waging wasn't with him. It was with the part of me that still believed I needed him to survive. I didn't. I was going to save myself. There's a strange silence that comes after a storm, a kind of stillness that feels unnatural. It's not peaceful. It's hollow, like the world is holding its breath. That's what my life felt like in the weeks after Liam left. I thought the worst part would be the loneliness, but it wasn't. The worst part was how empty I felt, like someone had carved out the parts of me that felt alive and left nothing but an echo behind. The apartment felt haunted, every corner filled with reminders of the life we'd built and the future we'd planned. His shoes were still by the door, his coffee mug was still on the counter, and every time I walked past them, it felt like a fresh cut, a reminder that while I was frozen in place, the world outside kept turning. Mornings were the hardest. I used to wake up to his arms wrapped around me, his sleepy mumble as he buried his face in my hair. Now, I woke up to silence and the harsh morning light streaming through the curtains. No whispered good morning. No warmth. Just me and the sound of my own heartbeat. I tried to keep busy. I cleaned the apartment until my hands were raw. I rearranged the furniture, hoping it would make the place feel less like ours and more like mine. But no matter how much I scrubbed or shifted things around, the ghost remained. His laugh still echoed in the hallways. His promises still clung to the air. I couldn't escape them. I stopped answering calls. Friends reached out, worried, offering coffee dates and distractions. But how do you explain to someone that the person you built your life around walked away because they couldn't handle you? How do you admit that you're afraid you'll never be enough for anyone again? One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. My skin was pale, my eyes dull and rimmed with shadows. I reached up, brushing my fingers over my cheekbones, noticing how sharp they'd become. The treatments were draining me, but it was the heartbreak that had hollowed me out. "Who are you?" I whispered to the reflection. But the woman in the mirror didn't have an answer. I sank to the floor, the weight of everything pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. The grief, the fear, the anger, it all came rushing in at once, threatening to drown me. I sobbed until my chest ached, my fingers clutching the edge of the bathroom sink as if holding on to something solid would keep me from unraveling completely. When the tears finally stopped, I was left with a quiet, bitter truth. Liam wasn't coming back. No amount of hoping or hurting was going to change that. I had spent so long defining myself by us, by him. I'd built my dreams around the idea that love could withstand anything. But love wasn't supposed to be a one-sided battle. Love wasn't supposed to leave you when you needed it most. I leaned my head back against the wall, my mind swirling with memories I didn't want to relive. Our lazy Sunday mornings, tangled up in sheets and laughter. The way he used to look at me, like I was his whole world. And then the last time I saw him, the cold finality in his eyes as he said goodbye. How had we gone from everything to nothing? The thought haunted me. But as I sat there in the quiet, something inside me began to shift. Beneath the wreckage of my grief, a new voice stirred, soft at first, but steady. "He's not coming back, but you're still here." The words settled into me like an anchor. I was still here. My heart was still beating, no matter how shattered it felt. My body was still fighting, even when my mind wanted to give up. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs. I was tired, so tired, but I wasn't done. Not yet. The next day, I forced myself out of the apartment for the first time in weeks. The air was crisp and cold, biting at my skin as I walked aimlessly through the streets. I ended up at the park where Liam and I had spent so many afternoons dreaming about our future. I sat on the bench where we'd laughed and shared secrets, my fingers tracing the worn wood. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I just sat there, letting myself exist in the quiet, in the messiness of everything I felt. I watched the people passing by, parents chasing after children, couples holding hands, an old man feeding pigeons. Life was still moving, even though mine felt like it had stopped. And slowly, I realized something. The pain hadn't killed me. It felt unbearable, yes. But I was still breathing, still alive. I thought about all the times I'd believed I needed someone to save me. But Liam's absence had shown me the truth. No one was coming to save me. If I wanted to survive this, if I wanted to live, I had to save myself. So I started small. The next morning, I made coffee. Not because I felt like it, but because it was a step forward. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the sun rose. The city below came to life slowly. The hum of traffic, the distant murmur of conversations, the world waking up around me. I sipped my coffee and let myself feel the quiet. I wasn't okay. Not yet. But for the first time, I wasn't drowning. The grief was still there, like a bruise that hadn't fully healed, but I wasn't suffocating under it anymore. I didn't need to fix everything all at once. I just needed to keep moving. One step, one breath, one sunrise at a time. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a version of myself that wasn't defined by the love I'd lost. A version of me that could stand on her own, not because she had to, but because she chose to. As the first rays of sunlight warmed my skin, I whispered to the empty room, my voice soft but resolute. I'm still here. It wasn't a declaration of victory. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a promise, to myself, to the woman in the mirror who had been through hell and was still standing. For the first time, I wasn't focused on who I'd lost. I was focused on finding me. The day everything changed wasn't remarkable at first. There were no warning signs, no dramatic thunderclaps, no sudden revelations. It began like any other. A quiet morning, the sky tinted with soft grays, and the city humming to life below my apartment window. But by the end of that day, my world would shift in a way I never expected. I had been following a routine, forcing myself into small acts of normalcy. Coffee in the morning, a walk through the park, a book I never finished. I told myself that if I kept moving, kept breathing, the emptiness would eventually start to fill itself. But that morning, as I stared at my reflection, eyes still tired but somehow more alive than before, I felt something stir deep within me. It wasn't a grand revelation. It was a whisper. You've been surviving. Now it's time to live. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep waiting for life to find me. I had to go out and find it myself. That's when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't check it. Most of the texts and missed calls were from friends who didn't know what to say to me anymore. But the name on the screen stopped me cold. Sarah Weston. Sarah was an old friend from college. A brilliant, relentless woman who'd built her career from the ground up. She was the kind of person who didn't believe in setbacks, only challenges to be crushed. I hadn't spoken to her in months. The message was short but direct. Alex, call me. I have an opportunity for you. An opportunity? I almost laughed. The last thing I felt ready for was a new challenge, but something in me hesitated. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way Sarah had always seen something in me, even when I couldn't see it in myself. I dialed her number before I could overthink it. She picked up on the second ring. Alex! Her voice was warm, familiar, and filled with energy. It's been too long. I exhaled a shaky breath. It really has. We exchanged pleasantries, brief and efficient, the way Sarah always was, before she cut to the point. I've been following what you've been going through, she said, her tone softening for the first time. I know you've been through hell, but I also know you, and I know that you're stronger than you think. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I held them back. I'm trying, I admitted. You're more than trying, she said. You're surviving something most people wouldn't come back from, and that's exactly why I thought of you. I frowned, confused. Thought of me for what? She took a breath, the kind of pause that comes before something big. I'm launching a new project, a foundation to support people going through serious health battles. Not just financially, but emotionally. It's not just about treatments. It's about giving people their lives back. She paused. And I want you to be a part of it. Your story, your resilience, it's exactly the kind of voice we need. The words hit me like a tidal wave. I wasn't sure if it was pride or panic filling my chest, but my heart was pounding. Sarah, I don't know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not there yet." "That's the point," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to be fully healed to help others heal. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to show up. Show people that it's possible to keep living, even when everything falls apart." Show up. The simplicity of it almost made me laugh. I had spent so long thinking I needed to fix myself before I could be anything again. But maybe I didn't need to be perfect. Maybe I just needed to start. "Come to the event next week," Sarah continued. "You don't have to commit to anything. Just see what we're building. I think it could be the fresh start you're looking for." I hesitated, fear tightening in my chest. Stepping into something new meant facing the world again. It meant letting people see me, broken, messy, imperfect. But it also meant the possibility of finding a purpose bigger than my pain. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "Good." I could hear the smile in her voice. "Whatever happens, just know that you're not alone. You've got people who believe in you, Alex. Don't forget that." We hung up, and I sat there for a long time, staring out the window. The idea of standing in front of strangers and sharing the ugliest parts of my life terrified me. But beneath the fear, there was something else, hope. The following week came faster than I expected. I almost backed out a dozen times, my mind spinning with every excuse in the book. But on the morning of the event, I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at a dress I hadn't worn in months. It was simple, a soft blue that Liam had once said brought out my eyes. I almost put it back, but then I stopped. Liam wasn't here anymore. This moment wasn't about him. It was about me. I slipped into the dress, took a deep breath, and stepped out the door. The event was held in a sleek, modern venue downtown. The room buzzed with conversation, but as soon as I stepped inside, I felt the weight of 100 eyes. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I wanted to turn around and run. But then I saw Sarah standing near the stage, waving at me with a bright smile. She believed in me. Maybe it was time I started believing in myself. She pulled me into a hug as I approached. "You came," she said, her eyes shining. "I knew you would." Before I could reply, she gently took my hand. "There's someone I want you to meet." I followed her gaze and froze. Standing at the edge of the room was a man I recognized from news articles, Nathan Hale, a millionaire philanthropist who had made headlines for his generosity and quiet brilliance. He was tall, composed, but there was a warmth in his smile that felt genuine. "Nathan," Sarah said, guiding me toward him. "This is Alex, the woman I've been telling you about." His eyes met mine, kind but searching. "It's an honor to meet you," he said, extending a hand. "Sarah's told me about your strength. I hope she wasn't exaggerating." I laughed, an actual laugh that felt real. "She tends to exaggerate," I said, shaking his hand. "But I'm trying." Nathan's smile deepened. "That's all any of us can do." As the evening unfolded, I found myself easing into conversations, the fear slowly melting away. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was stepping into something new. And when I walked out of that building under the city lights, I felt lighter. This was the turning point. Not because someone else had saved me, but because I had chosen to save myself. I wasn't the same woman who had begged Liam to stay. I was someone stronger. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the future. I was ready for it. The months that followed felt like watching the seasons change and fast forward. Everything in my life was shifting, growing, transforming. The foundation's work became my anchor, something I hadn't known I needed until it was there. Every story I heard from survivors, every battle fought, every scar carried, reminded me of my own strength. For the first time, I wasn't drowning in my pain. I was learning to rise above it. And Nathan Hale, he became an unexpected part of that journey. At first, he was just a presence, a calm, steady force in the background. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with a kind of quiet wisdom that felt rare. He never asked about Liam or the wounds I carried. He never pried. But somehow, he saw through every wall I'd built around myself. One evening, after an event for the foundation, we found ourselves lingering by the rooftop terrace. The city spread out before us in shimmering lights, as vast and endless as the future I was beginning to imagine. "You did great today," Nathan said, leaning on the railing beside me. His suit jacket was slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened. He looked more human, less like the untouchable figure the world painted him as. I smiled, the cool breeze brushing my hair back. "Thanks. I still get nervous every time I speak." He turned toward me, his expression soft. "That's what makes you authentic. You're not pretending to be invincible. People need to see that." I let the words settle in the quiet between us. It wasn't the kind of compliment that flattered. It was the kind that healed. "Nathan, do you ever get tired of carrying everyone else's expectations?" I asked, surprising myself with the honesty in my question. He chuckled softly. "All the time," he admitted. "But I remind myself that I'm more than what people expect me to be. I'm allowed to be more." The truth of his words settled over me like a revelation. For so long, I had defined myself by what others needed, by who I thought I should be for Liam, for my family, for the world. But standing there, under the open sky with someone who saw me as more than my grief, I realized something. I wasn't bound by anyone else's vision of me. I was allowed to be more. I don't know if it was the moonlight or the way the city lights blurred like a dream, but I felt brave enough to speak the thought that had been circling in my mind for weeks. "I'm not who I was when Liam left me," I said quietly, watching Nathan's face for his reaction. "I thought losing him was the end of everything, but it wasn't." Nathan nodded, his gaze steady. "No, it wasn't." For the first time, saying Liam's name didn't hurt. It felt distant, like a chapter I had finally closed. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs as if I could finally breathe without the weight of the past pressing down on me. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, I heard a voice behind me. A voice that once had the power to shatter me. "Alex?" I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid as I turned slowly, my heart slamming against my ribcage. There he was, Liam, standing just a few feet away, looking like a ghost from a life I'd left behind. His hair was shorter, his face thinner, but those eyes, they were the same, and they were filled with something that looked like regret. "Nathan," I whispered, barely audible. "Can you give me a minute?" Nathan hesitated, concern flickering across his face, but he nodded. "Of course." He squeezed my shoulder gently before stepping away, leaving me alone with the man who had once destroyed me. Liam stepped forward, his expression somewhere between guilt and longing. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," he said. I crossed my arms, more to steady myself than to guard against him. "And I wasn't expecting to see you." He ran a hand over the back of his neck, a nervous habit I remembered too well. "I heard about the event, and about you," he said quietly. "You've done incredible things, Alex." I didn't answer. I wasn't here for his approval. "I've made mistakes," he continued, his voice raw. "I should have stayed. I should have fought for us instead of running, and I've regretted it every day since I left." My heart twisted, not with pain, but with something else. Pity, maybe, or clarity. I remembered the nights I had spent waiting for him, begging for answers, drowning in my grief. I had been shattered by his leaving, convinced that I was nothing without him. But now, standing in front of him, I saw him for what he was, a man who had broken under the weight of fear. And I had risen. "I loved you," I said, my voice steady but soft. "I loved you so much that I thought I wouldn't survive losing you." He took a step closer, eyes pleading. "Alex, if there's even a chance, if you can forgive me." I held up a hand, stopping him. "I forgave you a long time ago, but not for you, for me. So I could move forward without carrying the weight of what you did." He blinked, as if the words hit him harder than he expected. "But there's no going back," I continued. "The woman who stood in that kitchen, begging you to stay, she's gone. I'm not her anymore." Tears welled up in his eyes, but I felt nothing. No anger, no heartbreak, just peace. "Goodbye, Liam," I said, and this time I was the one walking away. I turned and made my way toward Nathan, who was waiting near the elevator. The weight of the past fell away with each step, and by the time I reached him, I felt lighter than I had in years. Nathan didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just smiled, a small, knowing smile, and opened the elevator door for me. As the doors closed, I whispered something to myself, a quiet, final vow. I choose me. The world hadn't ended when Liam left me. It had only just begun, and now, with every breath, every step forward, I was finally living for me. The days after that night felt surreal, like I had finally stepped into a life that had been waiting for me all along. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by memories of Liam or weighed down by the endless what-ifs. There was only the present, and for once, it felt like enough. Nathan and I began spending more time together. It wasn't forced or complicated. It was easy, like finding something you didn't realize you'd lost. He never tried to fix me or fill the silence with meaningless reassurances. Instead, he gave me space to breathe, to figure out who I was becoming. One afternoon, as we sat by the edge of the river, watching the sunlight ripple across the water, Nathan spoke quietly, almost to himself. You know, when I first met you, I saw someone carrying the weight of the world. But now, you seem lighter. I smiled, hugging my knees to my chest. I feel lighter. I glanced at him. You helped with that. He shook his head, his expression thoughtful. No, Alex, you saved yourself. I was just lucky enough to be here when you did. The truth of his words settled deep inside me. I had spent so long thinking I needed someone else to hold me up, to make me whole. But standing in the wreckage of my past, I had built something stronger from the ashes. And for the first time in my life, I realized that love, real love, doesn't make you smaller. It doesn't ask you to break yourself down just to fit into someone else's world. It lifts you higher, makes you feel like more. But even as things moved forward, there was still one part of my past I hadn't confronted. The wedding dress. It had been hanging in the closet for months, a ghost I wasn't ready to face. It was more than just fabric and lace. It was the symbol of everything I had lost. But now, it felt like the final thread tying me to the past, and I was ready to let it go. The next morning, I opened the closet door and pulled the dress out carefully. The plastic covering crinkled as I unzipped it, revealing the delicate ivory folds. My breath caught as I ran my fingers over the beading, memories threatening to pull me under. But I didn't let them. Instead, I folded the dress neatly and placed it into a donation box. I paused for a moment, staring at the box before sealing it shut. The weight of what I was doing sank in, not just letting go of a dress, but of the life I thought I was supposed to have. I whispered a quiet goodbye, not to Liam, but to the version of me that had believed she needed someone else to be whole. A knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Nathan standing there, holding 2 coffee cups and wearing his usual easy smile. "Morning," he said, handing me a cup. "I figured you could use some caffeine." I took the cup, letting the warmth seep into my hands. "Perfect timing, as always." He glanced at the donation box. "What's that?" I hesitated, then smiled. "A new beginning." His eyes softened with understanding. "Want some company on the way?" I nodded, feeling the last remnants of fear fade away. "Yeah, I'd like that." We drove to a local charity that specialized in helping women rebuild their lives after hardship. I carried the box into the reception area, my steps steady, my heart light. A young woman behind the counter greeted me with a warm smile as I set the box down. "This is for someone who needs a fresh start," I said softly. She nodded. "Thank you. This will mean so much to someone." As I turned to leave, I felt something profound, a sense of closure I hadn't thought was possible. The weight of the past no longer pressed down on me. It wasn't dragging me back anymore. I had finally let it go. When we stepped outside, Nathan looked at me, his gaze steady and warm. "How do you feel?" I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. Free. The word felt like a quiet revolution, something I had waited my whole life to feel. Free from the pain, free from the expectations, free to be exactly who I was meant to be. Nathan grinned. Good. You deserve that. We spent the rest of the day walking through the city, the streets bustling with life. I watched strangers rush by with their own stories, their own heartbreaks and triumphs. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider watching life pass me by. I was part of it again. Messy, beautiful, imperfect life. As the sun began to set, we found ourselves at the park where Liam had once proposed to me. The old oak tree stood tall and unwavering, its branches reaching toward the sky. I stopped, staring at the spot where so much had begun and ended. Nathan noticed my hesitation and followed my gaze. This place, it's important to you, isn't it? I nodded, my throat tight. It used to be, but now, it's just a tree. He smiled gently. That's the thing about memories. They only have power if you give it to them. I stepped forward, placing a hand on the rough bark. I closed my eyes and let the memories come, not with pain this time, but with acceptance. When I opened my eyes, the past didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like a chapter I had finally finished reading. Nathan reached for my hand, and I let him take it. His touch was steady, grounding. Ready to go? He asked. I nodded, a small but genuine smile spreading across my face. Yeah, I'm ready. As we walked away from that tree, I realized that I wasn't just moving forward. I was stepping into a life I had chosen for myself. And no matter what came next, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of love, not of loss, and definitely not of standing on my own 2 feet. The world stretched out before me, vast and uncertain, but I didn't need a perfect map or a guide. I had everything I needed. And for the first time, I wasn't defined by what I had lost. I was defined by everything I'd become. The seasons changed again, and with them, so did I. Life no longer felt like something I was surviving. It felt like something I was living. Each morning, I woke up to the quiet hum of possibility instead of the ache of what had been. I wasn't just moving forward. I was thriving. The foundation grew faster than any of us had imagined. We expanded our reach, partnering with clinics and mental health centers to support people who felt like I once did, lost, terrified, and alone. I became one of the faces of that change. I shared my story in ways I never thought I'd be brave enough to. I stood on stages, looked out at rooms full of strangers, and spoke the truth. Healing isn't linear, and no one has to fight alone. One afternoon, months after that night on the terrace, I found myself standing backstage at an event in front of a sold-out crowd. The nerves I used to feel had long since faded into something else. Excitement. This wasn't just about sharing pain. It was about showing others that there was life after heartbreak, after illness, after loss. Sarah approached me, clipboard in hand, her usual no-nonsense attitude softened by a proud smile. You ready? She asked. I nodded, smoothing the front of my dress. I am. Good. She gave my arm a quick squeeze. They're here for you, and you're exactly where you're supposed to be. As I walked onto the stage, the applause rose up to meet me. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the lights, the hum of energy in the room. These people weren't here to see someone who had it all figured out. They were here to see someone who'd learned how to rise again. I began my speech the same way I always did, with the truth. A year ago, I thought my life was over, I said, the room falling silent. I lost someone I thought I couldn't live without, and for a long time, I thought that made me broken. But the truth is, losing someone doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. The words came easily now, not from a place of pain, but from a place of strength. We're told that love is everything, that it's the thing that saves us. But the hardest lesson I've learned is this: you don't need someone else to save you. You can save yourself, and when you do, you find out that you're stronger than you ever thought possible. I scanned the faces in the crowd, some nodding, some wiping away quiet tears. I wasn't telling them anything they didn't already know in their hearts. I was just reminding them. When everything fell apart, I continued, I thought I needed to go back to who I was before. But that's not what healing is. It's not about being who you were. It's about becoming who you're meant to be. As I finished, the applause swelled around me. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, letting the sound wash over me like a promise that I'd made it, that I'd chosen to keep living even when it felt impossible. When I stepped off the stage, Nathan was waiting for me, leaning casually against the side of the entrance. His eyes sparkled with quiet pride as he handed me a bottle of water. "You crushed it," he said with a grin. I took a sip and laughed. I almost cried during the middle part. You wouldn't be you if you didn't. He wasn't wrong. I was someone who felt deeply, who loved fiercely, and who had learned that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. Nathan had seen that in me long before I saw it in myself. As the event wrapped up and the crowd began to disperse, we walked hand in hand out into the crisp evening air. The city buzzed around us, vibrant, alive, and full of stories. I no longer felt out of place in that hum of life. I was a part of it. Nathan stopped at the corner where the lights of the skyline stretched out like stars. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, turning to face me. I raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile playing at my lips. "Oh? Is this where you tell me you're actually a secret superhero?" He laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Not quite." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. "I've seen you rebuild yourself from the ground up," Nathan said, his voice low and steady. "I've watched you fight, fall, and rise stronger than ever, and through it all, I've fallen in love with every part of you, your strength, your kindness, your stubbornness." He paused, his eyes softening. "I'm not here to save you. I'm here to stand beside you, whatever comes next." He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring, a symbol not of possession, but of partnership. My eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of joy, of gratitude for everything that had brought me to this moment. "Alex," Nathan said, stepping closer, "will you marry me?" The city seemed to fade away as I looked at him. This man who had seen me at my worst and loved me not in spite of it, but because of it. I thought back to the woman I was when Liam left me, the woman who believed she wasn't enough. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had become someone I was proud of. I didn't need Nathan to complete me. I was already whole. But I wanted to share my life with him, to build something beautiful together, not out of fear, but out of love. A smile broke across my face as I whispered the only answer that had ever felt right. "Yes." He laughed, a sound of pure joy, and slipped the ring onto my finger. The crowd on the street cheered as if they were part of the story too, their excitement blending into the rush of traffic and the hum of the city. Nathan pulled me into his arms, and as we stood there under the glow of the streetlights, I felt something I hadn't in so long: peace. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was mine. Messy, beautiful, and filled with moments I never thought I'd have again. I had learned to love myself, to trust myself, and to believe that no matter what came next, I could handle it. This wasn't the ending I thought I would have. It was so much better.